Hi, folks. Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how well migrants into Australia from 50 years ago, from third world countries, how well they, or even lower middle range countries, how well they integrated into Australian society and assimilated, given they were at that stage, the source of migration was fairly small. So they didn't have the option of living in, racial ghetto enclaves. They would be, the neighbours all around them would be English speaking. So they couldn't get together in their racial enclaves and maintain their, cultural and linguistic consistency from their country of origin. They kind of had to integrate. The incentive to integrate was huge, and getting by would have been almost impossible unless they integrated. So how well did they integrate, and to what extent did they integrate? And so I'm going to look at a few examples here just to illustrate the point, that some migrants just don't integrate. They don't want to integrate. And if they're forced, in effect, integrate because they can't go into their racial enclaves, if they're forced or default forced, if you will, into integrating, they bitterly resent it and hang on to that resentment for decades. So the source of migrant is very important. If you've got a primarily white society, Christian society, Anglo-Saxon society, rule of law society, social structures built around things like rule of law, due legal process, democracy, independent, government services and, the public service, that sort of thing, then it's really only people who come from those sort of places are going to integrate swiftly or even at all. And when I say swiftly, I mean, within 1 or 2 generations that the integration is complete. So say someone coming from Britain to Australia, and going back again 50 years, someone coming from Britain to Australia. Say there's a family there under 30. They've got 2 or 3 children, and they arrive in Australia. The children are all under the age of 10 or that around that age. All of them will grow up to be Australians, and the integration will be complete within that single generation. And they will view themselves as Australians and so on. Whereas if you then get the source of migrants, even from somewhere like, say, southern Italy, where there are the swarthy, or southern Greece, rural Greece, rural people with very minimal education. They've maybe done 1 or 2 years of high school at best, and even that will be some rural bullshit 1-class sort of school. They're Christian, they're European, but even them, it takes them 4 generations to integrate. That's the difference. It is, even though they're European, they're Christian, they're swarthy, not black or brown or something. It even takes them 3 to 4 generations to integrate. And whereas, say, somebody coming from Rome or the northern Italian cities, not only are they less swarthy, but they've probably completed high school, and they have some sort of trade or skill or something like that can be used in, they will integrate in 2 generations, for example. And so the source of the people and their standard of sophistication, if I can use that word, is critically important for considering how well or swiftly or easily they'll integrate. So let me look at 2. Now, this is an Indian family. I think they came to Australia in 1970, and the immigration from India was very, very small at the time, hardly any, not like today where it's the gazillions. Now, they arrived, again, 1970. They had a daughter that was 2 or 3 years old and a son that was born within, the woman was pregnant when she arrived, a son that was born, within months of arriving. They couldn't go to an Indian enclave. They couldn't live in an Indian enclave because there wasn't one to live in. And So they moved into a street that was completely English speaking. Now, talking to this woman who's like in her 50s or something now, the two-year-old. She takes the view that she was the victim of outrageous racism by white Australians, and she's never forgiven them for that, and she's believes that Australia is a deeply racist, fascist, Nazi, Hitler swastika country. But what is her reasoning? And this is really, comes down to how well people integrate, or their intentions to integrate, or their desire to integrate. So they arrive, and her parents speak with a heavy Indian accent. The father's had some government job or something in India. It's interesting how he managed to get to Australia. But anyway, he arrived, and he got some government job, I think, in the Department of Education, which I assume he was gifted. I doubt he could have got that on any sort of merit. But anyway, he's got a job there, and they're given a government house. So they're brought to Australia. They're brought into Australia, another country. They want to leave India and come just fine. They're given government housing, subsidised housing. The guy's given a government job, and now she's in a class where she's the only Indian there, but they insist on leading a devout Hindu lifestyle. So she arrives with the red dot on the forehead and all this sort of stuff, and she gets sent to school wearing Indian dress, and she takes Indian food, and they only eat curry in the Indian cuisine, and the mother walks around in Indian clothes, comes to meet the daughter at school wearing Indian national costume, and all this sort of stuff. So how well are they integrating? Now, in spite of all the subsidies and help they're given by the Australian taxpayer, they somehow manage to find the money to go back to India every year, so they can keep the gene and spiritual and cultural pool nice and fresh. Why do they do that? If they want to do it, fine. But you're desperate to get out of India, to leave India. So why do you go back there every year? I don't follow that reasoning. But anyway, so they live a devout and an in-your-face Hindu lifestyle, and very Indian lifestyle, but insist that everyone else, they're not doing anything odd or strange or different. Everyone else is treating them differently, and for no reason. Well, why are they treating us differently? Well, of course they're treating it differently. And because she's required to speak Indian in the house, in the home, for some years she spoke English with she learning at school. So when she arrives at school, she really doesn't speak much English, and what she does speak is with a heavy Indian accent. And so the kids at school make fun of her because she speaks strangely. She brings very odd food. Curry was, not widespread in Australia at the time. She wears Indian clothes and has Indian hairstyles and the whole sort of thing. So she's treated, she arrives very much a very different person. So when you want to integrate or assimilate, you don't do those things. So she was treated differently and was the object of fun at school now she recalls that not as her parents failing or her family failing to integrate or get her to integrate or assimilate. No. It's none of those things. It's those fucking damn Nazi, white fascist, Hitler swastika waving Nazis, racist bigots. They're the problem. Whoa. Stop a minute. You've chosen to leave your country of India and come to a white Christian country, and you want to behave just the same as you would have behaved in India. And if people sort of treat you differently because of that, it's their fault. They're the ones. Aren't you being bigoted by behaving this way, bigoted towards them? Why aren't you trying to integrate and assimilate? No, it's those Nazis. So here's this woman who and then, a girl at the time, she goes on and she's given a scholar paid for by white taxpayers. She's given a scholarship to go to university. I'm not sure she actually got that. I would speculate that was very much an affirmative action type gig. But she gets a scholarship. So the white taxpayers are paying for her to go to fucking university, where I think, again, she gets an affirmative action medical degree. One of the very few people at all that was getting it back in the day. Not many women were being given, not many women wanted to get the medicine. But, and the bar was set very high for medicine. I remember that when I was in high school. The bar was set very high. And so I would be very surprised, having spoken to her, that she would have come anywhere near that high bar. So I'm assuming affirmative action. So then she gets that, and then is given a government job as a fucking doctor, some sort of medical doctor on the government payroll. Again, I'm assuming affirmative action here. Now, she chooses to marry and date only Indian guys. Married one in the end, but she only was dating Indian guys. Was under pressure from a family to only marry an Indian guy from India. But she married a guy, I think, who was locally born in Australia, an Indian guy. So I suppose that is some small step towards assimilation. She insists her children are Indian. No, they're not Australian, but they're born in Australia, and you were born in Australia. No, they're Indian. That's it. No, they're not Australian. And so her resistance to assimilation in Australia was very high, even though she was born here and has been given every benefit, every advantage, every handout, every gift, every piece of affirmative action. She is absolutely fixated with Australia as a racist, Nazi, bigoted, fascist Hitler country, and she was treated badly as a kid, and that's all their fault. The fact that her and her family made not even the slightest effort to integrate and assimilate is irrelevant. It was all those bigot Nazis, and they're the problem. And she nurses these hatreds, and it is hatred, by the way, and this perverted desire for vengeance, nursing these hurts, and she still picks at the scabs today, even though she's in her, would be mid 50s now. So, given that source of immigrant from India, their desire and propensity to integrate is very, very low. They are a terrible migrant to bring into the white Christian world. Terrible migrant. They want nothing. Their only fixation when they come is to loot the white man's treasury. They've got no intention of integrating, no intention of becoming Australian or Western, whether it be on a spiritual level or any other cultural level. It doesn't matter. They'll only integrate enough as an economic integration, enough to be able to loot the white man's money and treasury. That's the extent of it. They want their own representatives. They want to be represented in any political sphere by their own representatives. They want their own people running the public services. They want to corrupt everything they touch. This is the sort of people. They are a diabolically bad migrant to bring into the West, and yet we're bringing all over the West. We're bringing them in by the gazillion, and it is a disaster of the first magnitude to do that. Now let's take another example. This is somebody who's another woman, by the way. This is a woman who came from Eastern Europe, from a rural sort of peasant area, but came from Eastern Europe. Now she's, or her family, she's white, so good integration possibilities there. Christian, again, not Western Christian necessarily, but the overall architecture of it all is Christian. And again, could not go into a racial or an enclave of any sort. So they were again given government housing, subsidised government housing. Came from Eastern Europe, and but they, even though they had something like a couple of years warning that they would be coming to Australia or to an English, that they only wanted to go to an English-speaking white Western country as migrants. That was it. They only wanted to do that. So you'd think they would prepare themselves, given that was their only choice. You'd think they prepare themselves by learning English. Now they were staying in some sort of European, I think it was a refugee camp of some sort, and so there were free English lessons being offered there. And as I understand it, the girl when she came, I think she was born in Australia and had a sister who's a couple of years older or something. But you'd think the parents would be learning English. It was free English lessons, on tap, books in English. That the whole thing was laid on. Didn't cost them a penny, and yet the parents never bothered to learn a word of English. I mean, why is that? If you want to go to an English-speaking country and you say, you know what, I want to go to an English-speaking country, but I'm not going to learn English. I mean, that doesn't seem to be a very sensible approach to things. Nonetheless, that was the mindset. So they arrive in Australia, and the girl's born in Australia shortly after the parents arrive, and yet the parents only speak this East European language in the house, don't bother with English. I don't know how the fuck they got by, but somehow they did. I mean, I think just government handouts and welfare, I think, was the thing. But when the girl goes to school, this is the girl who's born in Australia, she goes to school as a 5-year-old or something. She can barely speak a word of English. So she was, being taunted and was being given, as kids will. How could you be born in Australia here for 5 years? You hardly speak a word of English. Excuse me. But the same sort of thing played out where she wears East European type clothing, brings East European food to school, for lunch and this sort of thing, and does pretty much everything, East European hair and styles, pretty much does everything she can. Again, the family have done this. It's not her fault necessarily at 5 years old. Does everything it can to be different, to look different, to sound different, to eat differently, to stick out like a sore thumb. There's everything she can to stick out like a sore thumb. The family does nothing to prepare her for school or learn English. But her takeaway from this is that it was all those evil, wicked, Nazi, fascist racists that made her life unpleasant at school. And so she remembers that. Now, her English was a second language to her, so she would speak English, the East European language at school, and some more East Europeans had been discovered in the meantime. So she's hanging out with them. Her sister was at school, so they would talk in East European languages, and so on. I mean, doing everything they fucking could to be different, to not be part of the local culture. So they came to view this is Australian culture. They came to view the local culture, the local social scene and social structures as being evil and Nazi and fascist, even though they were making no attempt to integrate and assimilate. Even as a 60-year-old, she still nursed these hurts and still carry it with and you could see the hurt on her voice as she remembers these things, that everyone was bad to her. Did her parents make an effort to prepare her for school? Well, no, but that's irrelevant. It wouldn't have been a problem if it wasn't for those damn Nazis, and so on and so on. So at no stage does she take any responsibility for attempting to assimilate or integrate or doing so in a way. Now, let's suppose she'd gone to school speaking English. She hadn't been dressed up in the East European clothing or having East European hairstyles. She wasn't taking East European food to school. Let's suppose the parents had placed a premium on, look, we want you to integrate. We know that if you go to school behaving, looking, acting, and speaking differently, they're going to give you a hard time. It'll be a miserable affair. No, the parents didn't do that. Instead, the parents did almost the exact opposite. They behaved in a way that was guaranteed to cause problems for the kid. And the kid remembers only the hurts, not the failures of the parents, or her own failures for that matter, to integrate. I mean, she should have said to her parents, look, I don't want to go to school with this different food and hairstyles and so on. The kids are noticing it and I'm getting shit because of it. But instead it was a determination, I'm going to do it. And I'm going to be as difficult as possible. I'm refusing to assimilate. And if anyone gives me a hard time, it's their fault, not mine. I mean, that's hardly a sensible approach. But nonetheless, so let's suppose she had gone to school speaking English like any other kid. She'd been playing with the other kids in the street, learning English and fitting into the social scene, and had gone, eating local cuisine and wearing local clothing and hairstyle, the whole thing, just fitting in for goodness sakes. Then she would have assimilated quickly. She wouldn't have had any of these barbs or hurts that she remembers with such pain and anguish, even 50 years on. And so she would have integrated, and it would have all been much better than it was, and would have been fine. But they didn't choose. Now here's again two examples of failures to assimilate, even though on a prima facie basis that the numbers coming in are quite small, of these racial groups, but nonetheless the chances of them integrating quickly were already there. If you've got someone who's in a refugee camp for 2 or 3 years, they're insisting they only want to go to English-speaking country. You offer them free English lessons, and they don't even bother to attend. I mean, if I was the immigration officer, are you sure this is what you want to do? Why haven't you made any effort to learn English? It's free. It's you can go there. It's 7 days a week. Why are you not learning it? And if they go, well, why do we have to? It's everyone else's fault if we don't sort of get it on. No, you're not going anywhere, buddy. You're not going to go to an. You have to make you have to meet us halfway. You have to make the effort to integrate. And if you're not prepared to make that effort, or alternatively, you're brazenly saying, why the fuck should I make the effort? Then no, you're no good as a migrant, really. You're no good. It'll only cause problems. And this is really part of it. Now, I'll go on a third thing. I was briefly, I've mentioned many times, at a high school in Sydney. They had a high, mercifully short time, by the way, had a high migrant intake of Arabic migrants, Lebanon and that sort of thing, Jordan and the like. And these were supposedly Christians, but it must be a different sort of Christianity, the one I'm aware of. But they would talk Christian stuff, but would behave in a way that suggested they had no idea what Christianity was. They only understood it at the superficial. They would say, well, Mary, Mother of God. That's they would talk like that, but then would behave in ways that would suggest that whatever Christian teachings they'd been subject to had failed to penetrate at all. The callousness and the cruelty and the criminality of these Arabs was something I'd never seen before. 11-year-old kids running around with flick knives and things like that. Whoa! I couldn't even comprehend a situation like that, running around in gangs, the police coming around to the school every day and dragging some Arabic kid off, more than one per day. The attempted murder some of these kids were doing, the torturing that they were doing. They tie kids up and then torture them using magnifying glasses in the sun to burn them. Holy crap. And other things that, again, I've mentioned many times before in other videos. And even the ones that had been born in Australia or had been come at a young age and they spoke with an Australian accent and so on, they still weren't assimilating, and they were pugnacious in the extreme in declaring their difference to Australians, and we're proud of it. We don't have to integrate. Now they're brown and swarthy, dark brown, that sort of thing. So there's that, but they were Christian, and again, most of them were living in government subsidised housing, which they thought they were entitled to, and various other things. But even as kids that had been coming to Australia at a young age, or they were born in Australia, we're talking like kids 11, 12 years old, 13, that type of thing, but they still perceived that they still had this rural village peasant mentality that anything in the school was common property that everybody owned. So, they had no hesitation in just taking things from the school, taking, whatever, tools from the the woodworking carpentry room, or, or going into the medical cabinets and the woodworking room and then just stuffing their pockets. If the teachers tried to stop them, they would try and punch the teachers in the head, and others would join in, and so it would be a free for all, this sort of stuff. And again, I'd never encountered that, and couldn't believe anyone could have such a mentality. But they were very determined to be different. This was in their cuisine as well. Things like they turn up to school with, instead of a what would be a classic Australian school lunch, they turn up with things like tabbouleh or hummus and other Middle Eastern dishes, which was fine. I mean, who cares? But which meant they always stank of garlic. Again, who cares? But it separated them, and they were determined to behave and eat. Not so much look different. They were fitting in there, but their behaviour was completely different, and the callousness and the cruelty that they seemed to bring to the school was, again, something I'd never encountered before. So now, no surprises in that the amount of them that ended up going to prison for crimes, ranging from car theft to whatever, the amount of them going to prison was just off the charts. I bumped into a guy who came from that school, and I was, I'd have been my early 20s or something at the time. I bumped into, hey, what happened to so-and-so and so-and-so? And, the prime sort of criminals that I remember from that, they were all in prison, every single one of them, for goodness sakes. So, obviously it wasn't a helpful, behavioural path to take, but they weren't integrating either. And the choice of people coming from those, as soon as you get that peasant, tribal, rural thing, that it certainly slows down the integration process quite considerably, whether it's rural Greek peasant farmers or Southern Italian peasant farmers, or even the West European. There was from Belgium, there was some people I knew from Belgium, and they'd been sort of rural peasant farmers in Belgium. Now, Belgium was not a huge place, but they were rural peasant farmers, and they had something there that kids only had to do a year of high school because they're going to work on the farm or something like that. So you've got very minimally educated people, rural, very peasant, sort of parochial. They've never left the village that they lived in. To even go to the local town was a big adventure for them. And they decide to migrate to a first world, Australia, and their integration rate is very slow. Even though the kids arrive when they're 2 or 3 years old, it's their grandchildren that integrate, and they're white and they're Christian, they're West European, and they tick a lot of the boxes. But even them, as soon as you come away from a certain level of sophistication, the process will slow down of integration. And there's some examples of that. We've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.